evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and I'm here with my co-host, Gail Burke, and we have as our guest return engagement, Dr. Christian E. Weller, professor of public policy and also a senior fellow at the American Center for American Progress. Almost got it right. Welcome back, Chris.
Well, thank you very much for having me, George.
Well, the last time we were discussing infrastructure and the problems that the country faces in general. And one of the issues that you brought up was the need to do something about income inequality. And the take you were making was, if we don't have people earning money, they're not spending money, and the economy doesn't do anything. The other half of this game that bothers me is that the way some of the policies are going down these days, people are making some pretty, I think, dumb decisions. One of the things that I tripped over the other day was the largest buyer of U.S. stocks is U.S. corporations. So what they're doing is essentially borrowing money at insanely low rates and buying stock to jack up the EPS, the earnings per share, doing nothing to produce anything of value, and they get a raise out of it or a bonus, or they meet their goals for the year. And I'm starting to wonder what happens when these debts come due and somebody's got to pay for them.
Let me just talk a little bit about the first phenomenon, income inequality and share repurchases. Yeah. They're related to each other. So what has been going on for about 30 years, 35 years, is that corporations have changed the way they treat workers, often sort of keeping benefits and wage growth low, moving towards what's kind of contingent workers, using temp agencies, contract workers, and so on and so forth. Also cutting back on workforces when things get slower, and so on and so forth. What that means is for the corporations is they're very profitable. They also, during a recession, for instance, return to profitability very quickly. But on the flip side, workers have a much harder time getting out of a recession. So we saw this in the 1990 recession. We saw this especially in the 2001 recession, and we saw this particularly after the Great Recession in 2009. For instance, unemployment didn't come back until October 2010, even though the recession was technically over in 2009, and corporate profits already returned by the end of 2008. So that's sort of like the story how corporations generate revenue by essentially squeezing out workers. Now, the question is, what do they do with this money? They buy back their own shares to typically boost their own shares, and there is sort of an unholy alliance that has been built since the late 1970s between some investors, typically hedge funds and others, that want sort of short-term gains, and you can get those gains relatively quickly by buying up your shares. You shrink the supply, the price goes up. The other part of that alliance are managers, CEOs typically, who, to a large degree, now get compensated. In the past, in, let's say, the 60s and 70s, they would get a check, a nice check, a handsome check, but that's it, paycheck. Since the sort of gradually, since the 1970s, 80s, and then with a tax law change in the 1990s that had unintended consequences, what has happened is that you see that the actual paycheck for a CEO can be as low as $1 or maybe $100,000, but their total compensation can reach into hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah. And the way this works is they get stock options, which gives them an incentive to use all these profits that they generated, not through actual business interactions, but through squeezing out workers, to buy back shares and handsomely reward themselves. The reason why we know that this is coming the money is coming largely from squeezing out workers and not from generating new business and new business ideas is that productivity has actually been incredibly low, or productivity growth has been very low. Yeah. So it's not like businesses are investing a lot and becoming very innovative and generating a lot of revenues for everybody. They're doing exactly the opposite. Yeah. They're using the money They're squeezing out workers to reward some shareholders, short-term oriented shareholders, and CEOs very well. This problem of sort of short-term speculative greed that has hurt America's working class has been recognized by policymakers on both sides of the aisle. This is not sort of a clear division by party. Marco Rubio from Florida, for instance, has been very vocal about that we have to do something. The problem is any policy you can think about, or most policies you can think about to rein that in, are sort of things that somebody like Marco Rubio might recoil from. So that would be, you can simply outlaw.
For instance, what kind of things could you do?
Yeah, sorry.
Are you talking about the minimum wage?
That's on the worker side. On the worker side,
Okay.
you can raise the minimum wage, but we're talking middle-class workers largely. So the minimum wage wouldn't do much for them.
Okay.
There, it's more like make it easier for them to join a union. There are some labor law changes you can make. But by and large, you really need to rein this in at the top. So
You need to change the tax laws as well.
So there's a number of things you can do. The first one is you could theoretically simply outlaw the practice of corporations buying back their own shares. You could say like we're not allowing that anymore. Or you could say if you do this, we're going to tax you. So that's one way. There's other changes in the tax law that are a little bit more complicated. There's regulatory practices. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, could sort of slow it down and make it harder for corporations to buy back their own shares. That's sort of the practice that is happening. The situation is actually worse than what I just described, because part of the profits, yes, goes to CEOs, but the other part is they're using that money to buy up other companies. And so what that means is we have fewer and fewer and fewer companies, more monopoly, and now companies, like you look in as employers, but also as providers of goods and services to us, they have so much market power, they can demand higher prices. So it's not just workers that are paying for it, it's all of us in terms of higher prices for things that we need, be that pharmaceutical drugs, be that food and other things. Yeah. We have seen a growing concentration, for instance, in agriculture. There, in agriculture, it's sort of a problem really for rural America, because not only are we ultimately as consumers across the country paying more or get lower quality or whatever, but these agricultural behemoths in the Midwest and elsewhere can drive out the family farms.
But to me, this sounds as though they've known about it for years. The Congress needs to start doing their job. And they're not doing it. They're doing nothing. All they're trying to do now is just obstruct anything that the president is trying to do.
Well, that
seems to be their main function in life.
There's two things. Part of this problem, right, of corporations squeezing out workers, squeezing out consumers, and using that money to buy up other companies and concentrating their market power, or paying their CEOs handsomely. Part of that you can address through regulation. So you don't actually need Congress. You just need the regulatory agencies, such as this Securities and Exchange Commission or the antitrust enforcement agencies, whatever there are for the various industries, the Federal Trade Commission. They can do their jobs. They need more resources. They often need more enforcement resources from Congress, but that doesn't cost that much.
That means more money.
Yeah, but an enforcement agency costs relatively little compared in the grand scheme of things, and you could do so much in order to rectify that situation. You can do things through the tax code. That is sort of very complicated. Just imagine, like, it took me probably 5 minutes to explain this problem. Now, if you're in Congress, if you're a congressperson and you have to go out to the voters and stand there for 5 minutes explaining the problem and then say, like, and now I'm going to talk for 10 minutes of how we're going to change the tax law, no, you're not going to survive a voter town hall. It becomes incredibly complicated. It's fine to say, like, yeah, we need to address these excesses at the top and the way corporations are run for the benefits of a few. That's a good bumper sticker. But the underlying problem and the underlying solutions require so much detail and are very complex.
Yeah, but when congressmen and women go out to the public they don't have to explain in minute detail all the complications that are involved. My problem is, I think most of them don't understand it themselves.
No, that's correct. But imagine you're a congressperson. It doesn't matter which party you are, and you think, like as I said, Marco Rubio from Florida, you think that there is a problem that corporations are run for the benefits of the few, and you say, okay, well, regulatory interventions are fine, but we should do something about the tax law. You do need to explain it to the voters, at least in some form, that you're addressing a real problem that everybody has recognized: excessive inequality and slow productivity growth and workers being left behind. But that you're doing this by taxing corporations and limiting the incomes. I think a CEO is still going to be fine. Right, and it gets murky because, like the other side, you got to remember, you're proposing in the end to cut a CEO from, let's say, on average, maybe $10 million down to $5 million a year. These are very rich people who have amassed a lot of power, and they're going to use that power of the purse to oppose anybody doing it. And if you're a congressperson, you want to sort of stave it off. You want to say, like, okay, well, I'm doing this for the good of the people. And you're going to be primaried, you're going to have the tax coming at you, and so on and so forth.
The problem, I guess, is that I've seen it in several different articles that you go to Congress or you go to the Senate and you're spending 2/3 of your time raising funds for your next campaign. So the point you're making about the influence of the money is a very real one. The other thing I would like to understand a little better is you've portrayed two separate problems here. One is corporations buying back stock and artificially juicing their prices. The other one is treating workers like a commodity and turning them over very quickly. And what's the split between them? How much of the problem is stocks and how much of the problem is pushing the workers from the middle class to some lower class?
You can't parse it out because they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
That
means there's two different solutions.
Right, but as I said, because Gail asked about helping workers through raising the minimum wage, and that's as a policy solution. I don't want to put you in a spot of supporting or opposing it.
I am opposed to it because I think it's counterproductive.
But where we see the problem is really it's a middle class problem. It always has been, but you got to remember most workers who would be helped by the minimum wage have always been sort of on the fringes of the labor market. Where we see the problem really sort of coming in, especially after 2001, is middle-class workers, a typical engineer or manufacturing worker, or even the bank tellers and stuff like that. And people who make $20, $18, $20, $25 an hour. And it goes through all industries. You see this in the healthcare industry, you see this in banking and finance, and so on and so forth. And there it's much harder. It does require, if you want to help workers, one way is making it easier for them to join a union so that they have more power to sort of push back. But in terms of where the money is going, if you want to sort of shrink that gap, you really need to think about what you're going to do at the top. And that reining in excess pay for CEOs or at the same time limiting the concentration of companies.
Well, the concern I get about this kind of a discussion is that we're going into an age of more artificial intelligence, more robotics, and as we discussed the last time around, taking somebody who's been working on an assembly line, putting the left nut on the right-hand side, and training them to be a coder, I think that was one of the examples you used, that's kind of optimistic. But at the same time, the issue comes down to one of, okay, I'm a corporation, and I see that robot over there can save me a bundle of money because I can get rid of these 3 people, and the robots work fine. And I'm going to invest the money in that robot. So how much of that productivity gain from the robot is mine compared to the workers I just displaced?
Well, because you're making the remaining workers more productive, the remaining workers should get paid more. But the clearest evidence that that's not happening is that productivity growth has been below 1% over the last 5-6 years. So we're not seeing more investments. We don't see the robots. No. And in a lot of industries where this is happening, imagining what robots could do, they wouldn't really replace people, right? If you think about sort of one of the biggest growth industries is healthcare. Robots or automation is actually very useful because it makes sure that drugs are administered properly. It gives access to good health care to people who are in remote areas where there aren't hospitals, where it's not economically efficient to have full-range health services, and so on and so forth. But again, that's not happening. The money that basically companies take from workers is being given to shareholders, to CEOs, and invested by putting companies together. Now, you got to remember, you have now two problems. You have excessive inequality that squeezes out the middle class, and you have growing concentration in a number of, in almost all industries. Both of those problems get are recognized by both parties because they speak directly to the economic populism that is sort of prevalent in both parties. And the concentration, industry concentration, really makes pro-market Republicans, conservatives very nervous. It destroys industries, especially in agriculture, or firms in agriculture, which sort of hurts a lot of companies, small family farms and workers in rural America. So there is a lot of bipartisan appetite to do something. What exactly that doing something is going to look like is unclear. Yeah. My guess is, from sort of the noise I've seen, is probably the regulatory side, enforcing antitrust, limiting the ability of companies to merge into ever larger
to make monopolies.
I think that's sort of, I think we're probably...
Aren't there laws on the books?
There are laws on the books, but it's an enforcement. And there's sort of like, it often comes down to the laws, right? Like, are you in violation of the Sherman Act or are you not? But in the end, in order to sort of start this process, you do need to have an enforcement action. You need to have stricter oversight on the corporate side. You can do also more on the SEC, and I think that's sort of, again, I think we're...
So I think that's where Elizabeth Warren is coming into the game, is the reincarnation of Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, and that she's pushing against all these corporations that keep buying up. And you read it in the paper, like you say, every other day. Oh, this little tiny company just got bought out by Amazon or got bought out by Microsoft. And we've seen it in the healthcare industry with all of a sudden all the hospitals are merging. And next thing you know, all the doctors are working for the hospitals. And this starts out as a competition between the hospitals and the insurance companies. And the average person is caught in the middle and gets squeezed by both of them.
So I would say, given that we're sort of in full swing for the election cycle, I think the health issue, the loss of hospitals and healthcare providers in smaller towns and rural areas, I think is going to remain a big issue. I think it just got a big boost in terms of a momentum of conversation because we're shrinking the number of healthcare providers, right? They're concentrating bigger units. You're shutting down the ones that are smaller. And at the same time, we now got, just the last few days, the DEA released an opioid database. So a lot of reporters, a lot of researchers are going to start looking at where are the pills going, which counties. And what you will see is not only where the pills are going, but also where the overdose doses and overdose deaths are concentrated is going to be in areas that are underserved by healthcare providers. And I think that's going to give a lot of momentum to that conversation. Well, the other part is we have a struggling agricultural sector. We had a very wet spring that delayed the planting or completely eliminated the planting of crops. And at the same time, you now have trade issues that make it much harder to export some of the crops that have actually been grown. And it's unclear how some of the bailout for the farmers, some of the extra money that was allocated to them, will actually go to the small farmers that are being hurt. The expectation is, I think, that you will see a lot of family farms either failing or just giving up, saying like, this is too much. I can't operate. I already operate with so little income, so small margins. I'm just going to sell to the big guys. And I think that's going to be a conversation. My guess is that's going to start late this year and early next year, that there is a lot of farmers out in the Midwest. They're going to be very upset about what's going on, the greater concentration of agribusiness in their communities, the hollowing out of their communities. And I think that's going to drive a lot of pressure to do something, especially on the Republican side.
You know, I mean, this is part of the discussion we had last time, where you pointed out that if the farms start to fold up in these communities, there's nothing there.
Right.
And you still have to earn a living somehow or other. And the farms, yeah, they become somewhat valuable to the big guy who can buy them out, but he's not going to buy your house, too.
What happens? What happens to the people, the families?
Yeah.
And some of these farmers have been at it for many, many years.
Oh, yeah,
they're too old to retrain.
Well, when you talk about a family farm, it goes back generations.
Yep.
Yeah, the problem in smaller cities, right, smaller towns, and this is all over that's true everywhere. Once you sort of like, okay, the farm doesn't necessarily have to fail. So for somebody to say like, look, the rain, climate change, and trade wars, this is all too much. I'm going to sell and going to pack up, or I will keep doing this, but my kids won't continue.
Yeah.
And what you're going to see is a continued movement off these smaller towns, smaller cities around the country. And at some point, these places are going to be too small to actually have basic services, such as police, fire, and health.
Yeah.
And
I've seen that
at some point, you're going to be in a death spiral, because the state's going to say, like, look, the next nearest hospital is 2 hours away, and that's it. We're not going to provide any more services to you.
The reason I get a kick out of that is that if I'm in the VA system, among other things, and if I have to have an MRI, I have to go to West Roxbury, and that's 2 hours away.
Well, that's
but it's only 25 miles.
in Gloucester. I mean, there's really no big hospital there. Addison Gilbert is very limited in what they do. Beverly Hospital has taken over.
Well, and if you think about it, like, if that's happening in our communities, right? Imagine you're in a small town in Kansas and you're 2 hours away from anything.
Yeah.
And now you're losing another 20% of your population.
Yeah.
It's like you say, it's a
who's
death
left
spiral.
behind? Right? Who's left behind? It's like the people who've lived there for generations, who are in their 80s, who at that point can't sell the house, which is their biggest asset, and they counted on that in some form or fashion to generate retirement income for them, and they can't sell it anymore because there's nobody who wants to buy it.
How is the national debt related to what's going on? I know that the spending is out of control. And I was listening to Rand Paul yesterday, and they were talking about they want to provide more money for the 9/11 victims.
They will. Mm-hmm.
Which everybody was up in arms at him and Senator Mike Lee. And I watched him explain why they voted against it, or why he voted against it. He said because in the bill that was first proposed, there was something in there that said, look, if you're going to, I agree with giving more money, but you can't keep allocating money in perpetuity without some kind of a ceiling, plus the fact that you're not willing to cut back something else, like maybe studying the life cycle of a flea that cost $1 billion, you could cut that out. And they're not willing to do that. So it's just spend, push it down the road, and the next guy who gets elected president will have to deal with it. And that's what President Trump inherited.
Allow me to address all the points, hopefully I'll remember. The first one is there seems to be a deal around the 9/11 provider bill for the first responders. In that case, the deal that seems to be on the table is unclear exactly how it's going to happen, but is Rand Paul will offer an amendment that says we're going to put a cap on it. That cap
and he knows it's going to fail.
It's going to fail, and then the bill will pass. Second part, the bill overall is small in the grand scheme of things. If Senator Paul and Senator Lee are really worried about the national debt, they should take a hard look at the tax cut they enacted in 2017. It has done nothing for economic growth. It has only worsened economic inequality. Its effects are gone, and it has added hundreds of billions of dollars each year to our deficit. So if we're talking about ineffective policies, let's go after the stuff that is actually big. Now, you mentioned the bee. I don't know whether it costs us studying $1 billion to study the bee, but I would...
the fleet.
Or the fleet, sorry. I'm not sure about the fleet, but studying bees would be very important.
Studying bees would be important.
So, but again, most of our research money is very, very small relative to the big chunk. Where we're spending our money in this country is we're spending sort of on the spending side, mainly on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then the fourth item is the defense. We're actually spending about $2 trillion or more every single year through the tax code. It's an oddity of American policy, but we're actually spending money through the tax code, which the Europeans don't do. The way we do this, for instance, is that if the employer provides health insurance, part of health insurance premium, that is not subject to income taxation. That is a huge gift to people who have health insurance.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to because we have about 2 more minutes left.
Okay.
So I would love to disagree with you on the size of some of these
Okay,
spending
we've got a subject
amounts.
for the next visit.
Because my belief is, yes, you have small amounts here, small amount here. Put them all together. They add up to a big
No,
chunk.
what's out, if you look at everything sort of, as I said, you go from you go from education, you go down to from defense, you go down to education. Education is the fifth item. It is about a fifth of
That's
defense
a lot
spending.
of money.
This is school funds and Head Start, the stuff that everybody
I
likes.
know.
The other part,
Not everybody.
but the rest that remains is smaller than defense, like where you could cut. And these are all programs that people like.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got a program that they like, and they're calling up their congressmen and saying, I will finance your next campaign if you...
Yeah.
And
That part is no longer a problem. We no longer have the earmarks. We no longer have the bridges to nowhere. We're talking programs like Head Start. We're talking programs like
yeah.
Meals on Wheels.
But a program like, here's one small thing. Head Start has been an abject failure.
It doesn't seem to be like, so far
But
the
it
evidence
is.
suggests that all of that providing children with early childhood education is one of the biggest investments we can make for their success.
But it isn't working. That's the problem.
well, it's working
And you
for
take-
someone, it's not working for others, and
It's
that's where
working
the problem is.
for almost no one, because by the time they get to a certain grade, everything evens out. So it really, and they've proven this. So
Anyway, next time.
we have 1 minute. Would you like to wrap up in 30 seconds?
We talked about a lot of things. I think at this point, policy should take a hard look at the mechanisms at the corporate level that have led to excessive inequality, in particular giving more and more corporate resources to people at the top. That can happen through more regulation or through changes to the tax code.
Thank you, Chris. We appreciated you coming back.
Well, thank you very much for having
And we
me.
would like to have you come back
Sure.
again. We can get down to more nitty-gritty.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for watching. I hope it's been an interesting show. And I hope that you'll be watching our next show. Good night.